Good afternoon, everybody. Since we only have 90 minutes and since we could spend 2 days on this topic, I don't want to delay getting started. I'm Alan Morrison. I'm the Associate Dean for Public Interest and Public Service Law at George Washington Law School, where I teach civil procedure and constitutional law, which explains fully why I'm doing a program on driverless cars. Actually, the reason I'm doing this program is because I did another one a year ago when I was asked to do a program on innovation, and I said, I don't know anything about driverless cars. Sounds like a pretty interesting set of issues, and sure enough, it turns out to be extraordinarily interesting. We have a terrific panel. We're not going to do much in the way of speaking, but the first person we have up here is Anne-Marie Lewis, who is a full-fledged engineer and not a lawyer. The rest of us are lawyers, although one of my colleagues, Bryant Walker-Smith, is also an engineer. She's going to do a slideshow for you. She has a mechanical engineering degree from Carnegie, her master's from Michigan, a PhD from Michigan in mechanical engineering and natural resources and environment. She's currently the Director of Safety and Technology Policy at the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, which is the largest group, I think, that is working on driverless cars, or HAVs as they're also called. Prior to that, she worked at Booz Allen Hamilton as a technical advisor to advanced research projects for the Agency for Energy at the Department of the Energy. Anne-Marie?
Thank you. All right, thank you, Alan. So I'm still a little confused why they let an engineer into this conference, but I'm very happy to be here. I can't answer any questions you have on jurisprudence, but if you have any questions on homogeneous charge compression ignitions or internal combustions in general, that's what I did my PhD on, and would be happy to answer your questions. That being said, I'm happy to talk to you today about driverless cars or automated vehicles on behalf of the Auto Alliance. So who is the Alliance? What is the Alliance? We're a trade organization based in DC, also with offices in Sacramento and Southfield, Michigan, representing about 75% of the vehicle sales for passenger light-duty vehicles in the United States. Our companies that we represent are listed below. So you see they're international companies, but we represent the US portion of those companies. So what I'll cover today, I'll first go over some definitions. Engineers that work on standards love jargon probably as much or more than lawyers, it seems. Set some context with regards to current trends we're seeing in the industry. Discuss the role of states versus federal government. Go over some use cases and applications of the technology, benefits, and outline some issues and risks just to round out the conversation, try to be fair, and leave with some questions to think about. So first, the SAE levels of automation. For those who probably aren't involved in this day in, day out, SAE is the Society of Automotive Engineers, and they released a taxonomy in the form of a standard, J3016, that you can look up and download. It's free of charge. And this outlines 6 levels of automation, 0 through 5. And I'll go through these one by one on the following slides. But highly automated vehicles, as Alan mentioned, are what we typically refer to for levels 3 through 5, and that's what we are referring to when you hear the words self-driving car, driverless car. We typically try not to use those. They're more like buzzwords, and it's kind of confusing because people don't know what they really mean. But when you see that in the news, they are usually referring to levels 3 through 5. So to explain the levels of automation, our comms team put together this handy guide. So Karl, who happens to be German, is going to walk us through the levels of automation. Level 0 is no automation. So the human driver is entirely responsible, entirely in control. Karl does help out a little bit. It can provide warnings, but does not actually take control of the vehicle at any time. So here we have like a blind spot monitoring image displayed. Level 1 is driver assistance. Karl either controls the steering or the gas and brake, but not both. So it provides an input in one direction, not 2 axes. So this is like, lane keeping assist or adjustable cruise control. the driver needs to remain engaged. And the same for level 2. The driver needs to remain engaged. They are the ones in control of the vehicle. But in this case, Karl controls both the steering and gas brake in certain applications. So it's a combination of lane keeping assist and connected adaptive cruise control. All right, level 3 is when it starts to get more interesting. This is conditional automation. So Karl can be fully in control within limits. So there's what we call a minimal risk condition. If there is a failure of any kind of the vehicle will alert the driver, and the driver needs to take back control. So the driver still needs to remain engaged enough that they can take control in the case of a minimal risk condition. Level 4, high automation. Karl is able to drive entirely on his own in designated areas. So the major difference between 3 and 4 is if there's a minimal risk condition, Karl, or the computer, it will provide that fallback. They'll take control. The human doesn't need to take back control in this case. But there are limitations to its use. It's used in geofence areas or maybe restricted based on time of day or weather. So we've seen an example of this is GM's recent announcement, not that recent anymore, back in January, that they would like to deploy a level 4 vehicle in San Francisco in certain areas of the city. So they've mapped out those areas. It'd be geofenced to that specific operational design domain. Level 5 is the highest level of automation. And so there is no restriction on the operational design domain. So there's no geofenced area that it needs to operate in. The vehicle can drive anywhere fully by itself. It provides the fallback in case of a minimal risk condition, and the human does not need to intervene. So I think I just threw a bunch of probably new concepts at you, unless you've been following this topic. Are there any quick questions on the levels before I continue? Okay. Yes? Yeah. So that's a really good question, and I was actually going to point this out. So this seating arrangement is purely a concept. I don't know if this is actually realistic at all. There's a lot of crashworthiness concerns with occupants facing each other. So this is, an artist's rendition. And level 5 could also be dual mode, which means that it could be fully driverless sometimes, but other times if the human wants to drive, they can be able to. So it could have a steering wheel and brake pedals, or it could not, depending on the use case. Yeah. Okay, so we can't look at HAVs without a 5-minute detour. We're going to talk about the state of the industry. Sales over the last 50 years shown here. You can see it's very cyclical in nature, but there's been an upward trend the last 7 years, I think. It'll be interesting to see what happens to this, as a lot of the HAV use cases that are being discussed are in a ride-sharing application owned by a manufacturer. Not all of them are like that, but we are seeing a lot of first use cases will likely be a ride-sharing case. Evolution of car safety tech has come a long way. On the far left, we see early automated safety features like anti-lock brakes that were introduced in the 1970s, electronic stability control introduced in the 1980s, and then the last couple decades, we've seen advanced driver assist systems, or ADAS systems. And these are blind spot monitoring, lane keeping assist, adaptive cruise control, parking assistance. There's actually a list, it's about 50 different type of features. And these are all level 1 and 2. On the far end, we see automated driving system, or ADS. So the proper term from SAE is actually ADS-equipped vehicles, refer to levels 3 through 5. And, again, we have an artist rendition of how occupants might sit, but this is purely artist rendition. So automation isn't a new concept. We've been playing around with the idea for a lot of years. These images are pretty fun. They're from a popular mechanics magazine from the 1950s. Again, I don't think any of these vehicles would pass our crashworthiness standards, but the idea has been out there for a while. We really it got to be more highlighted in the press as a serious thing that was happening when the DARPA Grand Challenge happened back in 2007. I was actually a student at Carnegie Mellon at the time, and we didn't really have a sports team that we got behind, but everyone really rooted for our team in the DARPA Grand Challenge. So this was a big competition. I think they had to drive through a desert with all these, you see all the LiDAR and everything on these vehicles. And now, fast forward to 2018, I've pictured a few vehicles. Two on the right are concept vehicles introduced at CES this past January. And the one on the left is the GM vehicle that I mentioned that they announced to be deployed in San Francisco next year. I will mention, it's pending NHTSA review of their petition for exemption, but you'll see you'll see that it has no steering wheel built in, and also no brake pedals or gear shifter. So this vehicle is designed to be fully operated by the computer. I'll just point out the Toyota e-Palette too. It's a concept vehicle, but it's designed to be modular. So they've partnered with Amazon and some other companies, and they want to make it so it could be a shuttle if you want to put seats in it. It could be a hotel on the go, as pictured here. It could be on a delivery vehicle that just is occupantless and carries packages. They just have created this platform that now they can partner with different businesses on. So you're seeing manufacturers be really innovative in the way they think about their technology. So today there's 4 dynamics at large influencing the industry, and I want to point out that they're related, but they're not dependent on each other. The first is autonomy. So when we say this, we're talking about all the sensors on board the vehicle: LiDAR, radar, ultrasonic sensors, maybe cameras that providing inputs about where and high definition map input provides information to the computer on the vehicle about where it is. Provides it with crash avoidance information so it can safely maneuver and get you from point A to B. Ride sharing is another trend, as I've mentioned. Uber, Lyft, everybody knows, but manufacturers are partnering with companies like these and starting up their own type of ride sharing models as well. In electrification, we're seeing that manufacturers are on a trend to have more electric vehicles in their fleet, but automation provides an opportunity, particularly in a ride-sharing opportunity where you know where your charging station is, because that's often a limitation of personal owned vehicles that are electrified. So if you have a ride-sharing fleet, I'll just keep picking on San Francisco, and you know where your charging station is, you can optimize how your fleet is deployed. And lastly, connectivity. So this is DSRC, if you've heard about that in the news, 5G, any vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure communication that really, increases the safety in the long term of the vehicles. It allows you to see around corners more than just the sensor on board the vehicle could do. So you're approaching an intersection, and in your blind spot, a vehicle is also approaching. You're able to talk to that vehicle and know their position. So when is this all going to happen? You'll see various projections out there, but there's a Moody's study that we like to point to that cites that vehicle turnover is about 11.5 years right now. So it's going to take quite a while for these vehicles to become ubiquitous. They project 2055. So regardless of the exact timeline, we know the reality is that these HAVs are going to have to share the road with traditional vehicles for some time. And there's a new paradigm. Not long ago, safety and environmental objectives were not well aligned, but today we feel like with this technology, we can really harmonize these goals. You'll see different projections on vehicle miles traveled, that AVs would increase or decrease total VMT, but I can tell you I'm very optimistic. Before I worked at the Alliance, one of the projects I worked on at DOE was a funding project to maximize the energy efficiency of vehicles using look-ahead data from mapping and route optimization to optimize the powertrain control in real time. So there's definitely onboard benefits that you can't deny are going to happen. So without, yes?
I'm very surprised to see the length of the transition that we're looking at. That's something that is very significant in my understanding of the issue. You compare that to smartphones and some of the other, and I realize they're distinguishable in so many ways, but what are
Right.
the factors that are leading us to such a lengthy transition?
People like to hold on to their cars. I mean, it's like I said, the average age is over 11 years, and I think also the policy framework is needed to help with this. And another factor that might come into play, vehicles won't necessarily be for personal ownership, and they're going to be a little more expensive, at least at first, with all the sensors on the vehicles. So I think you're going to have a lot of those things happening. Yep.
Tiny short question, just a little bit to the side, but you referenced the increasing prevalence of electric vehicles as green. And we all have been trained to believe that electric vehicles are green or greener. And, but I read an article just recently that said that maybe people have been doing a false comparison and comparing older internal combustion engine economy with an electric vehicle as opposed to recent internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
And could you tell us what the right thing, because this was written by somebody who may be a little bit far right center, but the question for me is the current thinking that electric vehicles really are bottom line greener than the current technology of internal combustion engines?
Well, you've asked the right person, because I looked at this specific question for my dissertation and actually modeled downsized boosted gasoline engines with a high compression ratio and do a life cycle analysis to compare them versus fully electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. So I think you have to look at the life cycle, and it drives me crazy too when people make this assumption without going into the details. I think plug-in hybrids, depends where you charge the vehicle for them to be greener or not. But I think it is true, even compared to the most efficient engine we have right now, the efficiency of the vehicle will be higher from a purely electric vehicle. But you need to think about other things such as disposing the battery, energy to create the battery. But even with those things accounted for, at least in the modeling that I did and I've seen other people do, it is greener to have a full EV.
Okay, short
That's a
question.
challenge.
In terms of the transition, we several generations ago had a big transition towards more ecologically based automobiles by paying people to give up their existing cars that were pollutant machines. Couldn't that happen here if there is an economic advantage to having cars that are all able to sense each other?
Yeah, and that's a great policy question. Theoretically, it could happen again. We're not advocating for it right now, but yeah, that's a great policy question.
Okay,
I'll let
I
you
think
call in
we're going to
people.
need to cut off the questions because we've got a lot of other things. We've got a lot of law questions that we've got to deal with here. Okay, all right.
You only have cars. You haven't talked about trucks at all.
Yeah.
That's likely to happen before cars.
Yeah, that's because at the Auto Alliance we represent the passengers' cars. So that's not going to be in my presentation.
That question's on my agenda for our discussion here in a few minutes.
Okay, I'll try to move quickly. So moving more on to the policy side of things. Traditional policy approach won't work. At least that's as quoted by Mark Roskine, the 15th Administrator of NHTSA, he said, he opposes a patchwork of state regulations and promised a nimble, flexible approach. And I say this to segue into the current kind of guideline regime we have right now, which is and under his administration, they released the Federal Automated Vehicle Policy Guideline, and Secretary Chow updated it last September with the ADS 2.0, A Vision for Safety, which really there were just minor modifications, really. There's two parts. There's ADS safety elements, so there's a request that manufacturers voluntarily submit a document that states how they're complying with 12 safety critical areas for test and deployed vehicles. And there's also technical assistance to the states, and they discuss the role of the federal government versus states. So I just wanted to highlight, they state NHTSA has the has the authority to regulate on design, construction, and performance of a vehicle, while states are encouraged to regulate on operational things that they've traditionally done, like licensing, traffic laws and enforcement, liability, and titling and registration of the vehicles. So this is something both NHTSA and Alliance, we're working closely with the states, as we're seeing lots of activity. So this is the map from 2017. We're still working on updating it for 2018. There's been a lot of activity already this year. But in 2017, we saw over 70 bills in the states and over 30 states regarding to autonomous vehicles. So it's becoming less, well, I don't know if I want to say less confusing, but there's a lot of, learning curve that needs to be done with state officials, because everybody wants to do something to encourage the vehicles to come to their state, or in some cases, make them not come to their state. Like, actually, we just saw recently San Francisco wanted to make it so AVs couldn't operate in ride-sharing fleets around airports or stadiums. So everyone has their specific concern, and many things are in their jurisdiction to address. Uses, I'll just go through these pretty quickly. You see the benefit for consumers. Cars can be more easily shared. If you can't pick up the kids, Karl can. Karl can make separate trips to get mom and dad. Businesses, you can optimize your route planning, get things from point A to point B faster. Government, there's obviously good use cases here. Can be part of a more efficient fleet. Transportation service, Karl can optimize your route and cover first and last mile beautifully. And some benefits. So safety, environmental. Fewer accidents mean less congestion. Cars will drive more efficiently. You can optimize powertrain controls, and electrification will likely be a benefit. Safety, we know 94% of fatalities today are caused by human error. So we think there's a huge benefit for ADS-equipped vehicles to decrease the fatalities on our roadways. Progress and challenge. So this is showing in blue the fatality rate. Fatalities per vehicle mile traveled, I'm not seeing this right. So I think the point is VMT has increased and the fatality rate has generally decreased, but then there's been a slight uptick in recent years. So we want to make sure we address that, and we think that ADS-equipped vehicles using their crash avoidance technologies can do that. This is just showing that what I mentioned about the 94% number, the vast majority of fatalities are caused by human error. Defects is just the red triangle at the bottom. Infrastructure demands. We know that automated and connected vehicles require certain types of infrastructure improvements. For example, line stripping, we want to make sure that's clear and detectable by the sensors. For connected vehicles, we want to make sure that vehicles are able to talk to the infrastructure, optimize their route with the traffic lights, things like that. But some of the digital infrastructure can be more, they're definitely more in the future, but some of the more simple things that would also benefit conventional vehicles, we think can be done now. Access is a big issue, a big benefit. Karl gives freedom of mobility to those who otherwise would not have it. Elderly community and disability community are some of the main beneficiaries of this, and we're working closely with them, in particular the National Federation of the Blind. Economics and productivity will increase, and at least Warren Buffett projected that insurance costs will go down ultimately as we see these safety benefits realized. And we have to talk about the risks. To be fair, there's a headline, Tesla autopilot crash caught on dash cam shows how not to use the system. We've seen a number of crashes recently. So this is still very timely headline that we really need to do a good job of educating consumers about what the technology can and can't do. Autopilot's a level 2 feature. You still need to stay engaged the entire time. So this is really a serious issue. Government inhibiting adoption. We see Chicago's wanted to ban AVs. Massachusetts is fearing the rise of zombie cars, cars just driving around without any passengers in them. As these are things we need to consider and have smart policies to make sure that doesn't happen. Dislocation is another serious concern. You mentioned trucking, losing that portion of the workforce. To think about, there's other ways, there's other needs we're going to have, particularly, with aiding people that are disabled to get in and out of the car. With delivery services, you probably still need somebody at the car, unless you have a robot or a drone. You need somebody to help get that package to the right place. And data privacy and security are important aspects as well. We at the Alliance, we have a few ways we've addressed this. That we have the Auto ISAC from a cybersecurity perspective, and our privacy principles that we signed on to with global automakers. There's also provisions on these in the AV START Act that you might get into. And the public discussion might be somewhat misleading. This is from a while ago. I think it was the first Uber wreck. They titled Headless Uber Wreck, but it's actually the crash was found not to be the fault of the Uber. So last, I'll leave you with some questions to think about. How do you maximize the rate of innovation? How do you maximize the rate of adoption? And how to achieve policy coherence across agencies and levels of government? And I would add federal and state as well. So with that, thanks. I think I definitely went over time, but it was fantastic to be able to tell you about a little perspective on the history, moving from ADAS to ADS systems, the benefits that we're going to see, and looking forward to the discussion. I know we'll be talking about the START Act, and I think, from our perspective, it would be really great if we had a piece of legislation passed in the Senate that ensured, the safe deployment of these vehicles. So thank you.
Can you shut this off, sir? Okay, so we're going to proceed in question and answer format. I think I'll stay here so I can see the audience and see our panel members. Let me introduce the other panel members to you. We're going to begin our discussion with Bryant Walker-Smith, who is also an engineer, but he is mainly a professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and also an affiliated scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, a member of the Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Automation, and a reporter to the Uniform Law Commission drafting a bill on highly automated vehicles. He holds both an LLM in International Legal Studies and a JD cum laude from NYU, and the civil engineering degree is from the University of Wisconsin. Next to him is Victor Schwartz, who co-chairs the Washington-based public policy group of the law firm of Shook, Hardy & Bacon, and for over 3 decades he's been the senior author of the most widely used tort book in the United States, Prosser, Wade, and Schwartz on tort. Prior to entering the full-time practice of law, Victor was a professor and dean at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. He's a life member of the ALI and served on various restatement committees. Finally, we have Lorelie Masters, who's now a partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth here in Washington, and a nationally recognized insurance coverage litigator and lawyer for policy holders. Lorelie has advised clients on a wide range of liability coverages, including insurance for cyber, environmental, employment, directors and officers, fiduciary, property damage, and other liabilities. She's a co-author of 2 widely respected treatises on insurance law, and one of which is recognized by the English Court of Appeals as the standard work on the topic. Okay, so let me just say a few words at the beginning about the regulation of motor vehicles. For most of us in the room, we don't remember that it was not until 1966 that there was any regulation at all of motor vehicles on the front end. The law of torts took care of what was passed for regulation. And today, the states could have regulated, but they never did and Congress eventually stepped in, and the states still can today, unless, and we'll talk about what the unless means in a minute. The new regime put forth by Congress was different from regulation as many people think, that there is no pre-market approval for automobiles. It's not like drugs or nuclear power plants. Automobiles are regulated only when the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issues a standard. So as they did for airbags, safety glasses, padded dashboards, and so forth. All those things are now required, and when a car is manufactured, it doesn't have to be approved, but the industry self-certifies that they're complying with the existing standards. And of course, all of these assume that there is a steering wheel, a brake pedal, and an accelerator in the car, which, as you saw, in many of these there will not be, which creates some rather interesting situation. All right. The last thing I want to say before I ask the first set of questions about regulation and preemption is to remind us all that back in the 1970s, when the airbags were first starting to be talked about, Lee Iacocca famously said, "Safety doesn't sell." And if you will listen to the driverless car industry, they are selling safety. And if we could save 30,000 lives a year, that would be something really worth selling. And so the tension that I think you'll see is between what everybody wants, which is innovation, and what nobody wants, which is unnecessary injuries and harm to people. And the question is, how do you balance those two? And of course, when you read interestingly about a fatality of a driverless car that has one person is injured, when you think about the number of people who are injured every day in regular automobile accidents, it's interesting to see how the dynamics of the public relations in this world plays out, regardless of what the actual facts turn out to be. I am, to be clear on this, neither a proponent or an opponent of driverless cars. I'm an interested observer of the many problems that I think we're going to try to explore in the next hour. All right, so on regulation and preemption, I'm going to start with Bryant, and I'm going to ask him a few questions, and the others on the panel will jump in because we're going to be very participatory on this. So right now, if a company wanted to put a driverless car on the road, leaving aside any tort liability or anything like that, is there anything that the federal government, are there any federal regulations that now apply to driverless cars as driverless cars?
Yeah, so to pick up on your description of the federal regime, Alan, if a company wanted to sell or market or deploy into interstate commerce the vehicle, then they would need to make sure that it complied.
All right. So that's the first thing. Testing is different from commerce? All right. So the statute applies literally only to vehicles introduced in commerce, and that does not include testing.
The statute extends to vehicles that Congress thinks that they can and should regulate. And so that would extend to the sale, the lease, the deployment in interstate commerce. That could extend to the testing in interstate commerce. And in fact, the statute contemplates that.
It does. Is there any regulation now of the testing of federal regulation of the testing of vehicles?
Yes. Insofar as there is an exemption available to existing auto manufacturers if they want to test their vehicles in interstate commerce and those vehicles don't necessarily comply with one of the limited existing federal motor vehicle safety standards. That's only one aspect of the broader question of testing of automated driving at the federal and state level, though. So I wouldn't make so big of a deal about that.
And if now a vehicle is put on the road for testing purposes and the NHTSA doesn't think it's safe or has some questions about it, what can it do?
Yeah, so by testing, generally what we think we mean is the developer of one of these systems putting it out onto the road in mixed traffic to see how it does, with some expectation that it will perform reasonably, but generally with backup mechanisms in case it doesn't. A safety driver, in-vehicle monitoring, remote monitoring, all of the tests that we've read about for the last several years have been with a human behind the steering wheel, and only recently has that human moved to a different position in the vehicle. So that kind of testing, the first question would be whether the federal regime even applies, whether there's a gateway. Has there been a sale? Has there been a deployment in interstate commerce? And in most cases, the pretty confident answer is no, there hasn't been. And so the question of compliance with FMVSS doesn't necessarily arise directly.
Can they do anything? Can the government do anything about it? Is
Sure.
there some ultra-hazardous conditions?
Yeah, so most of what the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, could do would be using its soft power. If there was a vehicle component, motor vehicle equipment that was implicated, then the agency might be able to act more directly. But generally it would be NHTSA making life a little more difficult for the company. That would be if the company's announced an intention to market, investigating, sending a letter of inquiry, as NHTSA did in the case of one would-be startup, AI, a couple of years ago. Having serious, frank discussions with the company and alerting state authorities, because in many instances, NHTSA and the states, particularly their DMVs, have collaborated pretty closely on regulatory questions.
So to the extent that NHTSA doesn't have any special rules for these kind of vehicles now, what can states do about that? California now, we know California has issued some rules. There's a statute that required the DMV to issue rules. They've now issued rules in final form that purport to impose certain requirements on vehicles that are being tested in California. To what extent are those burdensome, and how are they operating?
Yeah, so there are a number of distinctions. One of them that you've made is between testing and deployment. We can likewise back up and say, are states permitting something that has previously not been allowed, or are they restricting something that otherwise would be allowed? And that kind of background presumption is very important to analyzing these questions. So California is one of the more prominent states to address automated driving. But automated driving testing activities are happening in a variety of states, some of which have passed legislation, some of which have only executive orders that can't contravene the existing legislative framework, and some of which have no legal action specific to automated driving. So what California has uniquely done is come up with dozens of pages of rules related to testing and ultimately deployment of these systems. They have developed those rules in consultation with NHTSA. And so NHTSA at least, or I should say the California DMV is at least confident that NHTSA believes that California is acting within its authority.
And that's because at the testing phase, we're talking principally about vehicles that are being driven, if I can use that term still, by people who are employees of the person that is manufacturing the vehicle.
Yeah, so testing, we have an individual typically sitting in a car doing the sort of things we would expect a driver to do, which is paying attention to the roadway, monitoring the vehicle, and intervening when the driver, and they are actually a driver, deems it necessary. One of the other distinctions that I think is helpful to understanding this is traditionally, as you explained over the last few decades, the federal government has regulated new motor vehicle design, while states have continued to regulate motor vehicle operation, at least non-commercial operation. And so you could approach automated driving as a question of vehicle design, insofar as the design is essentially the driver, or you could approach it as one of operation, insofar as the vehicle continues to be operated, even if not in the same manner. And depending on that perspective, you might see a greater or smaller state role vis-a-vis the federal government.
Do you think that the California rules with regard to testing are particularly burdensome for the industry?
No, California is in a unique position because they can do things that other states cannot. If every single state did what California did, but a little bit differently, that would probably be more burdensome for companies looking to deploy. But for testing, states are largely crafting regimes to be responsive to local conditions and working with developers that are often already there. And for deployment, even if every state copied California, or if every state said, if it's good enough in California, it would be good enough for us, then I don't think that would pose a significant regulatory barrier for developers.
Now, does NHTSA have any particular testing rules that apply to these vehicles? What about the guidance, for example? What is the effect of this guidance that they've issued?
Yeah, so NHTSA has, as you mentioned, developed voluntary guidance for developers, and that is voluntary. And NHTSA has taken some pains to emphasize its voluntary nature, even when that's called into question, going so far as to encourage, for example, states not to make compliance with the voluntary guidance mandatory at a state level. One of the big features of this guidance is NHTSA's request to developers that they publicly release what NHTSA calls a voluntary safety self-assessment, in which the developers, as I would describe it, say what they're doing, why they think it's reasonable, and why we should believe them, among a variety of categories, including the safety of the system, human-machine interface, cybersecurity. And that is supposed to be a way of starting the regulatory and public discussion about what these systems actually are, about the ways that developers are thinking through them, and really giving agencies the information they might need to start thinking about how they might approach these issues. Now, California, and there are activities all over the country, but in California there are more than 50 individual companies that are registered with the state for testing. There are 2 companies that have submitted these voluntary safety self-assessments, or at least have released them. In NHTSA's opinion, they haven't actually submitted them. That's GM Cruise and that's Google Waymo. So many companies have not yet answered NHTSA's request to submit these, either for testing or for eventual deployment.
So one of the questions, one of the things you talked about was operating the vehicles. For example, suppose that, and Anne-Marie mentioned the city of San Francisco. Actually, it's the San Francisco Airport, I think you mentioned. Yeah. San Francisco Airport, when they submitted their comments to the Department of Motor Vehicles in California, said, we are not going to let you drive any of these vehicles on our property. And there's a public highways. I don't know the exact who owns what. So where does that fit in? And suppose, forget about the San Francisco Airport, the city of Sacramento decided that they didn't want these vehicles on certain roads, or they didn't want them at certain times. Does the state have anything to say about that, number one? And does the federal government have anything to say about that, number two? And is this likely to be a problem?
Yeah, so first looking at the federal-state relationship, that's a question of state law. And states have taken different approaches. Some, in response to some lobbying, have already preempted municipalities from regulating automated driving. California is not one of those to act that much, but others have already. And so depending on state law, a municipality could impose the kind of restrictions that they might today, including conditions of operation, as we see for taxi regulation, parking, queuing, the use of local roads. We've seen these issues with other non-traditional vehicles, everything from low-speed neighborhood vehicles, now increasingly to scooters, electric bicycles, other devices. In terms of federal-state relations, again, this kind of comes back to how we conceive of automated driving, given that we have now the vehicle in some ways becoming the driver. Is this a question of federal law because of vehicle design, or state law because of vehicle operation? And Under existing law, there's a lot of authority that states have to act. There is an argument that under some federal law, including laws that require access to the federal interstate highway, a state could not restrict access of a vehicle to that system, or at least if they did so, they would lose billions of dollars in funding. But that hasn't entered into the conversation. It's not something that NHTSA or Federal Highways, which administers those programs, has mentioned or threatened.
All right, so let's shift to the next stage, which is operational. That is, when my understanding of what's going to happen, maybe I'll ask Anne-Marie if it's right, is that the current thinking is among the auto manufacturers that the first set of customers they're going to sell to are not you and me and individual owners, but are fleets basically for Ubers and Lyfts and perhaps for other commercial activities. Is that your understanding of where it's
Well,
going?
it depends what you're talking about. I think there's not one answer. There's the Audi A8 is going to offer the first level 3 feature, and that would be for personal use. That would just be limited use on highways under 35 miles per hour. So that's the only time that level 3 feature would kick in. So that's a more personal use, but then like GM is clearly a ride-sharing approach owned by the manufacturer. So, and I think we'll probably, for level 4, we'll probably see the majority in ride-sharing. Level 3 is still personal use.
Is that your understanding?
Yeah, we're talking, as Anne-Marie said, about a wide range of technologies, applications of those technologies, and business cases for those applications. There's not a self-driving car. It is really a wide range, and that means that we're likely to see automated features in some individually sold vehicles in the future. We're likely to see a range of what one might call more driverless systems being deployed as fleets, and a range of non-traditional vehicle platforms using automation. Little shuttles that go down your sidewalk or your street at low speed. And all of these will happen at the same time. At the same time, we may see individual tinkerers or startups that are modifying production vehicles, potentially even offering aftermarket devices that could change the automation capabilities of a vehicle. And so it's hard to talk about a single business model or even a single technology.
All right, so let's assume that that the manufacturers are now they're selling vehicles to whoever they're selling them to. All right.
Yeah.
The next question then is, that gets us out of the testing phase exemption and into the operational phase. And what can NHTSA do about that as of now? That is, what can they do? What must they do? Can they tell companies that you can't drive a car, for example, can't sell a car that doesn't have a steering wheel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think first of all, we're going to see some companies that are really eager to stretch the definition of testing as far as possible. And if we're talking about a world where Silicon Valley startups are comfortable losing money for a decade, or used a product used by hundreds of millions of people that was still in beta, then you could see that. At the same time, I think other companies are going to be very eager to claim deployment to escape some of the at least state-based testing restrictions. So even that line would be a little blurry. But at the point that a company is selling a vehicle or system, then NHTSA would have authority and the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards would apply. And so the first question is, what do those standards say about automated vehicles or vehicles with automated driving systems? And the answer is, we're not really sure.
They were, after all, not written with something that nobody had ever heard of in mind.
Yeah. So they, as you said, clearly contemplate or assume that there will be a human, but the standards nowhere expressly require that, and at most sort of indirectly require that. So in response to an inquiry from Google a few years ago, the chief counsel for NHTSA looked at a number of the standards and said that she's more interesting than I am. Said that the standards assumed that there was a driver. That driver, for the purposes of the standards in most cases, should be interpreted as a human, and on that basis found potential conflicts with a few of the standards. But what NHTSA suggested at the time was a way of reconciling that was simply to keep the steering wheel, brake pedal, accelerator in the vehicle, even if it's never used. Even if, and NHTSA didn't say this, but one could, you put it behind a big block of cement so that nobody can ever reach it. This is the distinction between Waymo's current approach, Waymo Google, and GM Cruise's current approach. Waymo has modified production vehicles and retained the steering wheel and brake pedal, even though in ordinary deployment they don't intend to use it. As a result, they have sought no exemption from NHTSA for the safety standards. GM has proposed a vehicle that will have no steering wheel or brake pedal. As a result, they have sought an exemption from NHTSA, from the safety standards, and I would imagine, would hope that that exemption would be expanded by Congress to more than the few thousand vehicles to which it currently applies. So that's one of the first divides. Do you overcome this safety standards question by simply leaving in the equipment, or do you keep it out and then seek another route to compliance? Now, there has been some suggestion that even if you have the equipment in, nonetheless that might introduce some issues with testing if it's not fully functional, but NHTSA doesn't seem to be inclined to go down that path.
So let me say a word about the current legislation. There are bills pending in both the House and the Senate. The House passed a bill back in the fall sometime. The Senate has reported one to the floor. It's been sitting there, S 1885. It's in your materials. Neither of them mandates that NHTSA actually produce any standards and regulate. What their approach seems to be is to create exemptions by statutory exemptions, saying that you can test certain vehicles and you can get approval for operations for up to 100,000 vehicles per year by each of the companies. Is that your understanding of?
Mostly.
Yeah.
So the bills would, let's say, strongly encourage, if not essentially compel NHTSA to begin a rulemaking process for
well, we know
automated
from
driving.
past history that if you don't tell NHTSA it has to do it, it's not likely to do it. Strongly encouraging NHTSA is like saying submit more guidance because they're particularly in this current administration. Yeah.
And so at this point, NHTSA's efforts seem to be focused on reconciling existing standards with automated driving systems, as opposed to specifically developing standards to regulate those systems. The bills would, as you said, dramatically expand the number of exemptions that are available per manufacturer per year, from a couple of thousand to in the high five figures, depending on the bill. And this, again, would be for those instances where a manufacturer is deploying a system that it has concluded could not comply with one of the existing safety standards. So that wouldn't be every automated vehicle, but that would be some. And the bills likewise codify NHTSA's approach to the voluntary safety self-assessments by encouraging, actually requiring developers to submit these assessments, but not providing a lot of legal consequence for them.
Right.
Sure, of course.
So, speaking of the exemptions, the exemption process would actually, it requires manufacturers to petition NHTSA for an exemption with the data that proves that the new technology that they have on the vehicle provides the same level of safety overall as the incumbent technology. So actually, this submission of data could help NHTSA inform them on what new regulations should look like.
So if they proceed by exemptions rather than by new standards, then presumably the preemption provision in the existing highway traffic safety law would not apply.
Yeah, so the exemptions are really interesting because they are tantamount to pre-market approval. to the kind of type approval that we see in Europe, where a manufacturer comes and says, this is what I want to sell, this is why I think it's reasonably safe, and they convince the agency of that. It's also an approach that the FAA has used creatively and at this point fairly effectively in regulating unmanned aerial systems, small drones. The regulatory baseline moves, and then they use the exemptions to create deviations from that and learn from it and be more flexible. So if there was no federal motor vehicle safety standard that NHTSA had promulgated specific to this, then that would not clearly preempt the states from regulating in that same area.
And these exemptions, there's no process for public participation in the exemption process. If NHTSA has to approve the exemption, at least as the current bills are drafted, nothing like the rulemaking process or for anything else.
Yeah, so these bills don't change the process for exemptions. They simply expand the number available. And so NHTSA would continue its existing process, which is governed by APA. And so not subject to the kind of extensive rulemaking process, but nonetheless something that could be subject to challenge.
Okay. All right. I think I want to move away. We perhaps have opportunity to come back to this issue about regulation and preemption. I want to turn now to the other side, which is torts and insurance. And let me start with Victor Schwartz. Victor, the states have traditionally been the rulers of the law of torts, and most of that has been by case adjudication. These are very different kinds of vehicles presenting different kinds of problems. Do you think that the state courts are up to deciding these kind of questions, and is that a sensible way to proceed, or what do you think about that?
Well, first, thank everybody for coming this afternoon. How many people here have a business reason with autonomous or vehicles? Only a few. So the rest of you just didn't have, the zoo is very nice now.
It's not even raining outside.
Interesting to me. I always learn, when Anne-Marie mentioned these levels of 0 to 5, tort law will change, I think, and state courts' ability to handle tort law is going to change as these levels get higher. The system was designed for what we have today. 2 cars crash, somebody hits a pedestrian, fault system, there's a driver who's responsible. But as we go away from that, I think it will change. State courts can't have 50 different ways of looking at it, and this is why. People want these things. Not everybody. If you learn a lot today, but just remember this one. Plaintiffs' lawyers call them driverless cars. Defense calls them autonomous vehicles. Because driverless cars picture the headless horseman, and they want to keep the same system. I would too, if I was still suing people. So it is going to evolve, and if society really wants these things, because they're going to save lives, because we will have less of a problem with drunk drivers, sleeping drivers, older drivers. If society wants these things, we've already seen, and I've been involved in at least 3 of them, when there was a societal need that Congress, even bipartisan, came in and put in, shall I say the word, liability limits. For example, in '94, general aviation was going in the tank because of excessive liability, and Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act. 18-year statute of repose. Plane can fly much longer than that. Cut off liability. Congress passed in 1998 the Biomaterials Assurance Access Act. Manufacturers of medical devices couldn't get raw materials because DuPont wouldn't sell them. So we protected DuPont. It's the only time I was retained on tort reform where I was protecting somebody who didn't retain me. The medical device company, they needed to get their stuff. In 2005, There were teachers who were flipping out over lawsuits. So not a lot of people know about this law, but we didn't want them to flip out, so Congress passed the Teacher Protection Act, which says if you follow school rules, you cannot be successfully sued. That's federal law.
Well,
So,
Victor, those are not well-known areas of federal law. You
Well, of
wouldn't
course,
escape.
and-
Even the most unattuned citizen would understand when the federal government is going to step in and start regulating driverless, or HAVs, if you would prefer, liability issues. Do you think that this is an area the federal government should step in?
it depends on what level we're at. When you're getting to 4 or 5, and that's going to be predominant, I think they will. It's not what I think. I think that they will. The vaccine and there's 2 roads.
Why do you think that
Because
this will be a radical change?
Not radical.
Oh.
They want the stuff. I mean, moderate tort reform it may be radical from Nader's perspective, but it's not from a lot of other people's. We're not taking their right to sue away. We're putting some limits, and there's 2 paths you can go on, 2 roads. One is liability limits, and the other is something like the Vaccine Compensation Act. They wanted vaccines so that people get their money, they don't have to prove fault, and people kick in to the fund, mostly the manufacturers. And once you get there, who's going to pay? I think there's a lot of questions. It's not quite whether we use the same slip and fall rules with McDonald's on Mars. I thought about that. But, and by the way, over on that table is Torts of the Future. This is a sensational little thing. It's written by my colleague, Carrie Silverman. I just came up with the name. I didn't have to do any work whatsoever. He wrote it, and he's very good, and his name is on it. But you'll find it handy. There are questions. A driverless car. The car is owned by somebody. Owned, right? And if the car is owned in tort law, owners are responsible. I am responsible for Kylie the dog, and I really have no control over Kylie too much. And by the way, if you learn nothing else today, dogs are not entitled to 1 bite, so just remember that. Common misunderstanding of tort law. So they may be treated as owners, and they're going to be responsible. Maybe the other analogy is they're like on the metro. Metro has a crash, and I'm sitting there. I'm not responsible for that. And which path will they go down? And that's a fundamental. The other fundamental, which Alan really wants me to mention, I think, briefly, is the standard of liability. Are these things going to be treated like products with strict product liability, which everyone in this room is smart enough to know is not really strict with design and warning, or is it going to be treated like a driver, a negligence standard? And I would think if I were making these products, I would want a negligence standard because it's less liability exposure.
Lorelie, your thoughts about this issue? Let's take it from a tort perspective first. We're going to come to the insurance in a minute. You think that the country is ready for a federal law for highly automated vehicles at levels 3, 4, and 5?
Well, I'm here to specifically talk about insurance. Anybody who knows me knows that that's what I do. I advise policyholders and do a lot of work on coverage. But I will tell you, right now we don't really have federal regulation of insurance, right? There's the effort, it was put into place, of the Federal Insurance Office, but the insurance industry does not really support that, and there's a question about whether it really has a role, given that insurance is a highly state-regulated industry, right? So before we started today, Alan, you said, how can you underwrite insurance when you don't know what the liability is? And the fact is that we're going to be, and I think people in the audience who represent insurance companies can weigh in here, but the fact is we're in this world where we have to figure out how to insure these liabilities before we've really sorted out the tort liability system. That's just the way it is. Insurance is going to be important, I think, just as it has been in every technological revolution, to help support innovation and to protect companies that are out there making these kinds of investments. But in the meantime, we're in a new paradigm potentially going forward. If by 2020, as some people have said, we're going to have a lot of autonomous vehicles on the road, I'm not certain about that. It's only 2 18 months away. But the fact is, you have to think about a lot of different paradigms here in terms of both liability and I would say insurance. Insurance should follow the liability, but in the meantime, or before we really get that all sorted out, who really is liable? Is it the driver? Does the driver take over? Is it the technology company? Is it the manufacturer of the automobile?
How about the software people?
Well, that's what I mean by technology. And the other thing, there are several things here that I think people need to keep in mind, both from a liability perspective and an insurance perspective. And that is that it's not just driverless cars. I think we all think about being in a car and being driven around. We're already there in a lot of ways. How many of us, I don't have my phone here, but you know, if I'm going to leave this afternoon and go back home, is anybody going to hail a cab? Now, maybe they are, I don't know, but a lot of us are just going to get on our device. So how has that insurance been working for everybody in the audience, right? Mobility on demand is affecting this. Electric cars, questions of overloading the grid. Is that going to be insured? You know, there's just a lot of issues here that I think people aren't thinking about or that we need to be thinking about. So one of the things I want to say is that this whole insurance and the liability construct then may affect this or follow it or lead it. I'm not certain. But a lot of insurance in a few years, maybe we're starting to be there now, is going to come through the automobiles that are being manufactured and sold because of the autonomous capabilities here. So a number of companies have said, we're going to accept liability. Well, they're going to have a system in place in order to handle those claims and self-insure or have some kind of capacity to make sure that the claims are going to get paid.
Are you talking about liability at the testing phase? Because I think that's pretty easy. There's a relatively small number of cars and on the road and limited number. But when you get out into the operational phase, when the cars are being sold, are there companies that are prepared to assume liability?
Well, yes, some have already said that that's what they're going to do. And if you think about it, if you and I don't own a car, we hail it or whatever. A lot of this, as I said, is mobility on demand, or it's the technology, the software, as you said, that's making the decisions. Well, that turns the whole existing construct about automobile liability insurance on its head. It eliminates that because it's been based around drivers. I get behind my car, I make behind the wheel, I make a mistake, my insurance is following me. But when I'm sitting in the back seat on my iPad, that's not the way it's going to work, right? It's going to work because the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, and the technology companies, the people who are providing the software, they're the ones who are going to be, I think, found to be liable because that's where the liability really is going to rest.
Well, let me ask you one other question. I'll come back to Victor in a second. Tell me, in your opinion, about the role that uncertainty will play with regard to the insurance industry until these liability issues are sorted out.
Can you help me there? Insurance companies don't like uncertainty, right? But
I had a suspicion.
Who
that
does?
Was a leading question.
Who in the audience likes uncertainty?
But they can't not write policies, can they?
No,
what are they going to do?
I think we're going to have, as we've been talking about on the panel, a period of time here where the existing construct on insurance is going to have to continue because we're all getting behind the wheels of our car. But we also have to think about it in terms of these, if it's true that my son is never going to own a car because he lives in Washington, D.C., and he doesn't see the need for it and doesn't want to pay the insurance and the maintenance, well, how is that going to work? So that whole insurance construct needs to be thought through, and we have to think about how do we provide that kind of capital so that we can ensure that liability. So innocent people in the tort system, right, are not bearing the brunt of this technology.
Well, in addition to the the liability that we have as owners of automobiles. We have our health insurance liability, our health insurance policies, which may or may not be affected by some things like subrogation. And then you have all the manufacturers of the various components as well as the vehicles themselves. What are they going to do about pricing when they don't know what the answers are? Assuming that we start to get more and more of these vehicles on the road, continuing, of course, with our mixed system, because as Anne-Marie pointed out earlier, it's going to be a long time before we have a highly autonomous vehicles that have a majority. I'll come to Bryant in a second.
The insurance is going to have to continue to evolve. So one thing that I think is an important public policy issue here is if General Motors, for example, is going to say, I'm bundling your insurance with the purchase price of your car because it's an autonomous vehicle or it's semi-autonomous, then how does that regulatory issue work, right? I mean, I think right now where we are is that that's a contract issue. But if you were an automobile liability insurer, that is all regulated by state law. There's state regulatory commissions that do nothing, well, nothing, they do a lot actually other than this, but one of their key things is to come up with standard form policies and to approve the forms that are in the insurance policies that everyone in this audience has if you have an automobile. Well, what does that how does that work when General Motors is bundling that insurance? It is insurance, but they're not subject to at least one could argue, they may not think they're really subject to the regulation by state insurance commissions. So these are big, I think, policy issues that we have to think about.
Alan, I want to myth pop here, and that is that the manufacturers say they're going to accept liability. Most of them are talking about what Alan mentioned, and that's only during the test phase, not when they're sold widely. I have not seen a specific document that I would accept as a lawyer that they are accepting liability once things are mass-produced. 2, when they say they're accepting liability, what do they mean? Do they mean pain and suffering that's 10 times the amount of out-of-pocket costs? Do they mean punitive damages? I mean, don't buy that. It's not really the answer. I've been on panels where people have said, well, that's the answer, they're going to accept it. That's not the answer, because the liability is, in the United States, is unpredictable. 2 juries with the exact same injury can come up with 2 completely different verdicts. That's why at some point there's going to have to be some configuration of rules that apply in interstate commerce. These things are going to be moving all over the place. And to have
here,
one
Victor the Radical Schwartz is here predicting federal regulation of automobile liability
I'm not
rules.
predicting federal regulation. That's a code word. I've never. It's not.
All right.
It's a tort system. It's not. This guy
Federal
talks about
tort of-
regulation.
The federal tort of automobile liability.
Okay. I've worked on for almost every bill that has had Congress has come in and put liability, from the VAC thing with Waxman, who was not exactly conservative, and he set up the Vaccine Compensation Act, to general aviation, where that was led by a Democrat in Congress. When something gets to a point where people want something, I want it. If they feel that way about autonomous cars, something may happen. I mean, we're all speculating. We don't know. I do believe it will be it'll evolve. And in these early stages, Congress is not tomorrow going to pass some tort liability thing in one of these bills, like 1095 or whatever it is. But at some point it may.
Brian, you've written about liability. Tell me, do you think that the existing system by which tort rules evolve over the decades, can that work for highly autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, we're in a world of second best solutions. So I'm not going to say that our current system is great, but we've stumbled along, and we'll stumble through this as well. As Victor mentioned, we're all speculating, but I think our speculation falls on a spectrum from saying there will be quirks, which we can spend some time talking about because we're all legal geeks and find legal quirks really interesting, to there will be a crisis, and that in some way will compel, necessitate, or justify extensive federal intervention. And I would be reluctant to conflate those two discussions, that just because there will be some circumstances that are unpredictable and will cause changes, necessarily means that the only answer or the inevitable answer will be federal intervention to standardize everything.
Do you think cost would be a factor? In other words, if some liability system could save a person $1,000 a vehicle or something like that, would that be a factor if you were a senator that you'd consider?
Oh, I would not presume to be a senator. Can I just be a law
If you
professor?
were. Well, I want you to get down to where,
So I can
you are here.
at least let me pretend to be a business person. And when these systems are introduced, the expectation will be that they are safer than conventional driving. Now, expectations are always disrupted. We could be surprised. But it would be irresponsible and unwise to introduce a system that is less safe.
But there still will be accidents.
Of course there will.
Nobody contends that. I mean, right, Anne Marie?
So, to the extent that we're talking about at least being safer than today, then in the first order question, we're talking about hopefully a lower frequency of crashes. And so that begins to help us set some cap on this discussion. Now, I take what I believe would be your point, Victor, that the payout in the case of a corporate defendant may be different than the payout of an individually insured driver. And so that certainly recalibrates. But we have a data point there, which is all of the companies today that commercially insure their operations that involve human drivers whom we know to be imperfect and to cause crashes. And so every time you order a package, you are paying some small costs in that package for the liability that the companies involved in shipping that to you will incur when their drivers mess up and hurt somebody. And notwithstanding that, today we still are able to get packages and pizzas delivered. And so I expect that companies working with their commercial insurers, as opposed to consumer-facing automotive insurers, will be able to provide the kind of information that will give those insurers some early assurance to reasonably price commercial insurance to handle those kinds of costs. And then, given the dynamic nature of these systems, it will be interactive. Companies will get a better sense of what their risks actually are. They will adjust the price they charge, not per vehicle sold necessarily, but per trip taken or mile traveled or monthly subscription package paid, and they will muddle on through it with all of us.
What about the bin Laden of 2040, who figures out the codes and 1,000 vehicles go crazy on one day? How do you handle that liability?
So there are systemic risks that we're shifting from into the system today where tens of millions of people harm each other by being careless, to one in which failures will be likely more systematized, rarer, and potentially less foreseeable. And that would be a question for insurers the same way it is today with any kind of risks we might describe as unforeseeable. Do they take that into account, and do they not?
Lori, did you say?
I was just going to weigh in on that. The fact is that I think insurance companies do this all the time, actually, because we're in an era where there's so much evolution of technology, they really have to. So one of the huge risks here that we haven't really talked about that's implicit in or part of an autonomous vehicle is the whole data collection, data privacy, cybersecurity. It's been alluded to, right? But if you have been in the insurance markets at all in the last 20 years, the insurance industry's really had to work quite hard to try to figure out what these kind of cyber exposures are. And with all this hacking today, I would say that continues to be an issue. So I think what insurance companies will do is they're going to pay a lot of smart people to model this the best way they can, just as they have with other risks over the
But my
centuries.
question is, can they model it without knowing what the law is? That is, you can assume physical risks and other things, but without knowing what the law is. So let me put the question to you this way. When I drive my car improperly, not paying attention, and I hit somebody, I understand, somebody can figure out what the cause of that accident was, or if my brakes fail, the cause of the accident. But what do we do with a vehicle that's programmed to do something, and either it doesn't work the way it's programmed, or it works but it kills somebody else, who is at fault? What is the meaning of cause in that situation? And do we understand what that means, and can we try to model our liability rules and our insurance rules until we know more about what we think cause means in that situation?
Well, I think we have the tools to do it. It's not to say that they fit perfectly and that there won't be a lot of evolution, just as there has throughout the decades, centuries that we've been living with the common law, right? And
So
tort
do you think
liability
this
systems.
evolution will occur through the
Who
common
screwed
law?
up, right? I mean, if it's what if it's a fleet of cars that are communicating with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the technology fails. And I think it seems likely that we will, as we've said, have fewer accidents in the future when we have more autonomous vehicles, but the severity
Hopefully.
could be quite a bit worse. But if the technology fails, the software, we already know how to deal with this in the traditional tort framework. It seems like, to me, duty, breach, causation, damage, right? I mean, I think that's the first thing I learned in law school. It was certainly one of the first. And so who had the duty? Was there a duty? And were they at fault and caused this massive pileup that caused all this bodily injury and property damage?
And is the ordinary consumer, owner of the car, or the victim going to be in a position to prove cause in that kind of situation with highly technical questions at stake?
I think there will be class action lawyers that will help us figure this out, possibly.
Bryant?
Yeah, law's shown itself very adept at addressing these situations. Victor, I think I'll quote an article that you wrote that I found so inspiring, where you went back and you identified the way that common carrier doctrine emerged, or heightened obligations were imposed on companies in light of new technology risks. In the same way that I would expect that courts that confront these issues will come up with shortcuts. Maybe that's re ipsa loquitur. Maybe that's the malfunction doctrine. Maybe that's a renewed sense of manufacturing versus design defect. Maybe that's the legal fiction suggested by Hillary Rowan and the UK government that automated driving systems are the permissive drivers of the vehicle owners in a way that we can impute their performance directly to the owners, who, as you, Victor, pointed out, could be held liable under existing principles. Courts and lawyers, as you said, Lorelie, are remarkably clever.
All right. I think I'd like to throw the matter up for the discussion. Yeah, questions?
I'm wondering whether this doesn't have to accelerate. I mean, we can't really have 10 years of luxury in developing this law at the state court level, because most departments of motor vehicles, I think, require the owner, if he wants to get a new license for the next year, to show some evidence of insurance. We certainly have to in Pennsylvania, I assume. And the question is the DMV asking for the certificates of insurance from the right people? If you have a level 4, level 5 car, is it going to be relevant whether the owner has to prove they have coverage, or whether the manufacturer of the system of that vehicle has coverage? Isn't that going to force this issue?
Depends who the clerk is at the DMV, maybe. And whether the clerk are there any clerks from DMVs here listening into this conversation? Well, I don't know what would make sense. That depends on what the law is, doesn't it? Yes. So
This is a question that the Uniform Law Commission is engaged with right now in development of their model uniform law. And actually, Tom Putaweg over in the corner is the chair of that effort. So, yeah, run, Tom, run.
So
it's
I
really
want to ask you,
interesting.
I read the draft, the February draft. It didn't seem to have anything to do with liability. It had to do with regulation. Are you working on liability now, too? Or is that a secret?
Well, they have to merge, because if you don't ask for, I mean, they ought to merge. I mean, they should.
Lawyers are great at saying two things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And so let me continue that fiction. We are not explicitly addressing questions of civil liability. Certainly we are addressing a number of issues that could be of relevance to a discussion of civil liability.
So the bills in Congress are not do not deal with liability for two reasons. One, the questions are too hard, in my opinion. And the second is the committee that has jurisdiction over the regulation, the Commerce Committee, is different from the committees that have jurisdiction over liabilities, which is Judiciary Committee. Yes?
Yeah, so I thought the GMP question was interesting because the fact of the matter is that many people who get into these vehicles don't need a driver's license because they're not driving. So, I think to me that that's a level of question that's very different. The whole point of people who are blind, disabled, or maybe are too old to drive safely in their lives or others, the whole point is they don't have a driver's license.
No, but they have to register their vehicle, don't they?
I don't know, maybe not. Maybe they're just failing some vehicle. But I think that's part of the whole point that has to be addressed. So
Yes,
using a driver's
yes,
license,
yes.
for example, isn't going to get us anywhere.
Gentlemen, second row.
I think one of the important things to note too, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators came out with their guidelines last week. And one of the things they dealt with is they were not trying to provide all the answers to a complete level 5 because the level 5s do not exist right now. And they basically noted that, and we will adapt the rules as they are today to deal with them. And when we have a proven safer Magic 5 that has no controls, no ability for the occupant to do anything in there, including emergency stop buttons or closing the doors, and then the majority of these cars are out there, then they said they'll address the issue. But we're far away from that at this point, and creating anticipatory regulations to deal with something that is a long way off is probably not the answer.
In the back row, please.
That's exactly what the Chinese are doing right now. They expect driverless cars, level 5s, on their roads within 3 to 5 years. They're working on their system, totally rewriting their laws now in order to do that. And they've indicated that the companies that are developing these have come directly to the Chinese government and said, we will absorb all of the liability. Now, we don't know, I don't know if anybody in the room knows what level of liability there is. But it seems to me that that's under the Chinese legal system, or that's yet to be determined by the Chinese as they're rewriting it. But I think that's a more intelligent approach to work out the framework before we have these cars.
Yes.
My question deals with hacking because we know that the more computerized a vehicle is, the more it's subject to being hacked. And we've seen with Jeeps and other vehicles. So it seems to me these driverless cars have more potential to be hacked. That can be good in the case of bank robbers escaping in one. The police can hack them, right? But also, the bank robbers could hack a driverless police car. So what are the additional safety mechanisms that the companies are trying to put into play to avoid potential hacking?
Anne Marie.
So you're right. The more entry points there are to a computer, a vehicle, the more connected it is, the more, you could say the more likely it could be to be hacked. But manufacturers are well aware of this and working to install many redundant layers to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm not privy to all the details of that, but we have a working group, the Auto ISAC, where they share any vulnerabilities that they found in their system. It's a way, to share non-competitively in an anonymous fashion. So that's really great. We also have a couple standards activities of best practices that manufacturers are developing with SAE, also internationally with the International Standards Organization. And I'll also mention, as the technology, as we are more connected, you can look at it negatively, but you could also say we're able to do over-the-air patches and updates to correct for these things. So over-the-air updates is something that manufacturers are fully capable of doing now, but it's another interesting regulatory framework because actually in Europe they're struggling with this because they have a type approval system where they have to pre-approve everything. So over-the-air updates is, where they're trying to work out how exactly to do that over there. But it's something that, we think can be a great advantage for mitigating cybersecurity.
So to your point about hacking, it's not simply that they're hackable, it's that they're designed to be open so that they can communicate with other vehicles and communicate with stationary objects and signs and so forth. So it's like the barn door is continually open, and the question is whether anybody can do anything about it. A committee of the National Academy of Sciences, I think, is going to hold a workshop on this sometime in the fall on this very, very issue. And of course, the data privacy issue that Lorelie mentioned, tremendous data privacy questions about who is going to have access to all the data. Some of it's being kept and is needed to be monitored to determine whether the vehicles are operating safely or not and what the problems are. But on the other hand, what happens to all the data when all of us are traveling around in vehicles and giving them instructions of what's happening to the data? And there's a last issue, which we haven't talked about at all, which is the issue of the impact on the workforce. Someone earlier asked about trucks and vehicles. Huge expectation is that cross-country trucks and buses will be some of the first areas where these vehicles will come into play. Both the bills in Congress have exclusions, don't apply to any vehicles over 10,000 pounds, and the same is true in the California rules. Unclear what that means. That is, they don't permit them, but they don't exclude them, and so we have that little problem.
California expressly prohibits the testing or deployment of heavy vehicles.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah, the federal legislation does not apply to those vehicles, although it arguably would apply to automated driving systems in those vehicles, which means that existing law would apply, and to the extent that those systems can be deployed consistent with existing law, they would be lawful.
But then we have the question whether they can and will be tested and then made operational. So there's a huge impact expected on workers, particularly Teamsters and bus drivers and people like that, for whom there will be many fewer drivers and many fewer people in the car. Where are we on time? Has anybody got the time? We're already past time. All right. Anything final words from anybody here on the panel?
ALI was kind enough to put on their website an outline I did. There's the new ALI Paperwork Reduction Act. Maybe you haven't heard of it, but it's a very good thing. We won't see all this punted paper, but you can find it there.
So I want to thank the panel and thank you all for coming.